all of us know that when you get stuck in your head about something, right, and you're only seeing your story, you're only seeing your perspective, that doesn't lead to pro-social behavior usually. All right. Alma practices being concise. Take one. So what are we doing today, Julie?
Stories.
Yes, see? It's so nice to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to see you. It's been a minute.
But why? Why has it been so? Like, why haven't you wanted to record a podcast?
Well, I don't know. You skipped the country. I had another child.
Oh, right.
Things have been going on in our lives. What's that?
I was trying to set you up for that one.
Yeah, I know. I figured.
Child and I left the country, so we didn't let our audience know, but we're back.
We're back. Yeah. Do you think people missed us?
Obviously, 3 of them at least.
At least that's pretty good.
Maybe 5. Oh, what do I know?
Well, don't let it get to my head.
I know.
Really, like the ego is just.
I missed us, so that counts.
I missed us too.
And then probably one other person.
Amazing.
There you go, 3.
Yeah. Before I forget, I want to give a big shout out to my friend Taryn, who graciously let me use her apartment to record this podcast.
Yeah, that beautiful Taryn, your friend, has a beautiful birds of paradise in the background there. That's
that is nice. I see it now that you pointed it out. Anyway, well, I'm excited to record this podcast with you today because I've been wanting to talk to you about the research that you did. Also we should point out that you finished your master's.
Yeah.
Yay! Congratulations, Alma.
Thank you.
Happy times.
Mixed feelings, but no, it's cool.
Yeah. What are the mixed feelings?
Well, I am a nerd, and so I've loved the experience of not only like the class time and the research time, but also, when you have scheduled classes and projects and whatever, that gives you like the accountability. You're like constantly in that learning community. And it's just so stimulating, socially, emotionally, intellectually stimulating. So I'll miss that. It's like, it's a unique time in your life. If you choose to do grad school, right? It's a unique time, and I don't associate it with like stress and like papers and homework. Sure, there were some of those moments, of course, but it was so valuable for me, and I really love the community. The community is not disappearing. The community just needs to be cultivated.
It does,
like in a different way, which means I have to be like more intentional about it and more, just on the ball to make sure that I continue to contribute to and be a part of and stimulate community. So that's where it's mixed, because it's not right. And then also like the student life, even though I was broke, it's
part of the student life.
Part of it. I was like, like the starving student thing, whatever, not really, but I was broke. And so I am, but I've only not been a student for a few weeks, but basically there's a special, like there's something beautiful about also just kind of focusing your energy instead of being productive, like more about learning and going deeper and questioning and dreaming up kind of new dreams, to be a little bit mystical about it. But there's a freedom to it because you have a different type of social life, but it's really cool. So that student life is fun. I know that the chapter is, coming to a close, and that's okay. I think I'm ready for the next step, but I can't just say like, oh, phew, thank God that's over. No, it's not like that for me. It's like, okay, I guess
one thing an adult. Yeah. Well, one thing I'm hearing, and I can relate to this too, is that also when you're a student, you kind of take on the identity of like being a student. There's an identity thing. And I also wonder, and this kind of brings us into our topic today, like identity is also connected to like what story you tell yourself about
Yes.
your current mission and like what your
Yeah.
focus is. And like, because it's true, you're right that throughout life, and you and I, we are lifelong learners, and we're always
Right.
going to be reading something and interested in things and stuff like that.
Right.
And at the same time, there are different times in life. The focus is different, right?
Yeah.
Right. And the identity is a little bit different. And
Mhm.
so I think I can totally relate to that. How like when there's something very special about being a student, and especially, you know, a grad student, where your focus is very, very much about like learning and about learning about a specific topic and engaging in a community of learning. And there's something that's really, really special about that time, for
Mm.
sure, for sure. Yeah. So let's get into the capstone thing. Capstone, by the way, is what we call thesis, the master's thesis
Yeah.
in our program at Northwestern. And so before we even start, and I have some kind of broad questions for you, but just tell us very briefly, what was the title of your thesis? And even in one sentence,
Yeah.
tell us, what was it about? What were you studying?
All right. Alma practices being concise. Take one. Okay. Title. You're giving me a challenge, Tuli. Title was Team Narratives and Collective Efficacy, A Tale of Many Arcs.
Oh, I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One sentence, what it's about?
Yeah.
It's research on why we should pay attention to the invisible sense-making processes that people undergo on teams. Does that make sense?
100%. Just explain what sense making is.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So sense making, kind of like it sounds, it's the internal, so in our head, or psychological, right, and emotional process that we have of making sense of experiences. So it could look like that internal voice, that inner monologue, some people call it, right? But it's whenever we reflect on, like, I don't know, you have an experience with your team, like you go through a project and together you might say like, oh, you know, the high fives moment, like, we did so well, that was great, oh, we really showed them, I don't know, like, our clients, this is great, we're all getting promotions, we're getting bonuses, whatever it is. And you might kind of in a natural way as a team make sense of what happened, and you attribute the success to certain things. Okay. You were the VIP because you did this and you did that. They're like developers, like, oh my gosh, the last time we shipped that solution, it really just hit them where they needed it, etc. Like, oh, you knocked it out of the park. Like even those common phrases are a way that someone is sense making. So like, it's one thing is the event or the experience, and the other thing is how we interpret it and give it some meaning and some sense in our lives that's relevant to us, right?
Awesome.
So
could we also say it's the story we tell ourselves about the event?
Yeah, I was just going to get to that. So I tend to, thank you. I tend to focus specifically on like narrative sense making, like how we make sense of things, of experiences through different narrative elements. And narrative elements is just any concept that comes from the whole big world of story. So like metaphor, when we make a metaphor like, oh, that project was such a bitch, that's a metaphor, right? And it's a common one, so most of us kind of understand that, like, that means it was really, really tough. Probably not a PC metaphor, but it's there. And then another element of narrative, analogies, personification. So our client, being maybe an organization or a team, is so bossy, but it's not one person, it's a team, or it's a company, or like or that team is arrogant. That's actually, we're personifying, because we're not talking about one person, we're talking about like a group of people, okay, or whole organizations. That's even narrative.
So if I'm understanding correctly, you're talking not just about like Because when I initially hear story, right, or
Yeah.
narrative, I think about, oh, like, yeah, we tell ourselves, let's say, stories about who we are or about the
Yeah.
kind of experience that we just. But you're actually saying something even more specific, which is that we tend to use these different methods, like these different storytelling methods, in the way that we tell ourselves, or that we make sense of what just happened. And by doing so, we actually have an effect on how we go through experiences. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, it still is stories. So like metaphors are part of a bigger story that we have. So you're right in that we do tell ourselves a story. And a story, I'll just take a moment to kind of define it, is the interpretation, right, of like a beginning, a challenge, a little bit of drama, a turning point, and a resolution, right? That's like your basic kind of story structure. Any story has those 4 or 5 elements, right? There's a time and place. There's a thing that happens. There's drama around it. And I don't mean drama like reality TV drama.
Sure.
I don't mean that type, but there's
like almost conflict.
Like
there's some sort of
emotions.
conflict.
There's around the conflict, there are feelings, emotions, whatever, or challenge, because it could be a challenge. It could be a really positive thing. It could be a really hard thing, whatever. And then there's a turning point, right? And some type of resolution to the original challenge or conflict, because we can't let it just be to be continued. So what I was really doing was giving some examples of how that story might show up, right? Because metaphor is a part of story. Metaphor, right? It will fit into a larger story that we have of reality, of that experience, of that. So going back to the team that just really had a big success right now, and they're telling each other like, oh, that project was such a bitch. And you were the MVP because you did this, and like, oh, that was great. And when you did this and we did that, like you can see how they have told themselves a story about the conflict of whatever the project was. There was a turning point, they were successful, and the resolution, like they've made some meaning of their experience, and they have some conclusions about, in that case, who they are as a team, what they're capable of, what they did, right? But it's in a story format.
Sure.
It's like archived in our brain and in a story format.
Okay, so let's back up for a second, and we'll get back to more specifics of team and what you have been thinking through and the research that you do. But you know, Alma, ever since I met you, I've known that you are into stories. That stories, narrative is something that you care about. I mean, you went to story camp, right? Right. You take this pretty seriously. I happen to also love stories and storytelling and things like that. I've thought about that maybe from a slightly different angle. But when did you first realize, even just going back, when did you realize that you love stories?
I probably realized that I love stories when I was a adolescent. The first memory that I have, it's actually on my website, which is funny, but it is the first memory. Like we'll
put it in the show notes. Link to Alma's website.
Oh yeah, well, it's just my name. I was very unoriginal. almaquiroga.com. .com. Yeah. Luckily, it's not a very common name, so it was available. But basically, I was probably 11 or 12 years old, and believe it or not, if you know me, I'm very much a sociable extrovert, right? But I also love reading, and have also always loved reading. So I'm a bookworm as well. Don't ask me how those two coexist, but I do remember spending a lot of like weekends. Maybe I'd go out and do social stuff, but then I would like read like crazy, and I read like a lot of fiction literature. And I started kind of at a young age. Like I read A Wrinkle in Time when I was in 6th grade. So that made me like 10, which I need to reread because I'm sure I didn't understand more than half. Right. And I read a bunch of classics. Yeah, exactly. So I remember reading a book which is now a little bit controversial, Gone with the Wind, but I'm just going to mention it. On the website, I don't mention which book it is. And I remember getting so emotionally involved with the protagonist, with Scarlett, and how dumb she was. Anyways, basically, I started identifying emotionally with this protagonist, with this character, even though I didn't really have much in common with her actual life, but I connected emotionally with her, and that happened a lot. And I remember getting really frustrated. And when it ends, the book ends in a way that I didn't love. I remember slamming the book down, crying, but like tears of anger, and going out to the living room because I was reading on my bed, and going out to the living room where mom was doing something. And I like slammed my fist on the counter and was like, she's so stupid. And my mom just looked at me like, what, who, scared. And I'm like, she's so stupid. How could she tell him that she doesn't love him? How could she be so prideful? How could she? And I just like go on this rant, and I'm really crying and I'm angry because I feel that her stupid decisions, I don't know, have affected me. And I'm 12, right? And my mom is like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, the book. And she just starts laughing. And she's like, it's a fictitious character. Like, you're okay. And I was like, no. So I spent that afternoon pretty angry. And then it kind of went away. And later it dawned on me, like, why did I get so involved with this with this person who doesn't exist? Like, what was it? That's a really thick book. So like, the author employs some storytelling techniques to really bring you in, right? Like in good. And so then that led me to writing. I wrote a lot of fiction since probably 6th grade. I was constantly writing stories. I was reading a lot. And it just, I don't know, I connected emotionally. I don't think I had the capacity at that time to really reflect on the why. But when I got into undergrad, I knew that I wanted to study the humanities. I wanted to understand, I don't know, humans a little bit better, why we are the way we are, as the meme says. So why am I the way that I am, right? And so I did study, I ended up studying sociology and took a lot of literature and
writing.
Did
you also do some theater?
Yes. And sorry, I actually got into theater.
That was before.
Yeah, my bad. So of course, through theater, you end up studying story as well, and why story is important. What makes the story, like, what is the value of theater, which is a way that stories are told, right?
Absolutely. What
is the value, and why can theater, why can these stories really impact people's lives, even bring about real change? Why can theater be a catalyst for change? Why can books and fiction books and nonfiction books be catalysts for change? Which are words I would have used if you interviewed me at that time in my life, but I was just very passionate about it, right? Yeah. And so then I'm there, and I realized that I love story. I don't necessarily want to be a writer, but I start to see like the links between story and how important story is for humans, and how we learn through story, and how we make sense of things through story, and human behavior.
Amazing. So no, that's awesome. So at what point then did you discover that you can kind of think about stories, or even take stories and use them as a tool for people in the workplace, or really in their everyday lives, but especially in the workplace, because that's kind of really what we're talking about?
So fast forward, I moved to Bogota, Colombia, at about, I think I was like 27. And because of my profile of being bilingual, and I don't only worked in the US 2 years, but whatever, I knew both cultures. There was this multinational, I get an interview with the president, and he has this business problem, which is, it's kind of twofold. He's like, our people, big company, open offices, they need to have better English and more opportunities to practice their English. And it's very like a siloed kind of workplace culture. And by siloed, I mean that like the different departments and areas didn't relate well with each other. Yep. And he's like, I don't know exactly what it is, but I don't want to hire traditional workplace consultants. And he knew them well. He didn't want to hire his Deloittes and whatever. I want you to be here. So I became an in-house consultant. So I was spending 25 to 30 hours a week. They gave me a room. Nice. And one of my first tasks was like to design kind of learning experiences and environments where these groups could come in and practice very practical English, in like more scheduled, there weren't really classes, but like scheduled time, right? Of 45 minutes, etc.
So 1 second, before you did that, did you have to, so you went in and they kind of told you what the problems were, right? You didn't do
the problems that they wanted me to solve.
It's like
Yeah.
it's like very straightforward. Like we need people practicing more English, and we need to get less silo. We need people talking to each other or whatever.
Yeah, we need to mix it up here because like they don't talk to each other and it's ridiculous. Like it's not okay that procurement doesn't talk to logistics barely unless it's like very specifically emailed. It's not okay that they'll be like 3 seats away from each other and they'll send emails.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So he had a clarity on what he wanted to change. He didn't know exactly how it would work. And he gave me so much autonomy. And then like I ended up kind of forming a little group within there. And also was working hand in hand kind of with HR, the head of HR, but he's like, I don't want something traditional. I think that if there are relaxed, kind of enjoyable, fun spaces and it like kind of experiences, I don't know what you'll think of, but if you can do some things like that where people naturally have to talk to each other and it's like a different way to break down the walls that there are between the different areas, maybe that will work. So like, I just want you to try things, bring me ideas and try. And so I kind of intuitively, I guess not intuitively. So I'd studied sociology and a little bit of anthropology, right? And so one of the things, I mean, I at least had the basic idea of what's ethnography. So what is, and basically I had a chance to do very low-key ethnography because I was there, I was an outsider.
And what is ethnography?
Ethnography, well, I'll skip the technical term, but it's basically when someone is an outsider of a community and goes in and tries to be kind of a fly on the wall and not touch anything and really observe things as they are. So observe human behavior. So whatever, like maybe their rituals or their norms or like how they talk to each other, right? So like cultural anthropologists will do this.
Like anthropologists.
Yeah, a cultural anthropologist will go and like live with a tribe for, there's many famous anthropologists who do that, right? Or did that and learned a lot. Sure. Right, like one of the famous, like the pygmies, etc. So then learn about their culture without, and like really trying not to touch it. So that's why I'm making, if you're listening, I'm like putting my hands up as if I were against a wall, really trying to be a fly in the wall. So I started observing these wonderful people, getting to know them. I had the advantage of like being this kind of outsider, but I had these experiences, whatever. And as the more I observe them, so now I'm getting to the point where story comes in because I have this challenge. Use types, learning phonics spaces, however you think of it would work here, to get people to integrate a little bit more, to talk with each other. And it doesn't have to be about work, but actually just to get to know each other. We need some of those informal spaces. And I had an open door as far as like which way I could do it. So I spent a month or two just getting to know and observe and listening to how they talked about each other. And I remember even going into the bathroom, the women's bathroom, not both bathrooms, the women's bathroom, and seeing how like a girl from accounting and finance would literally not even say hi to a girl from logistics, right? Stuff like that.
Okay, I'll let you finish up. But I mean, were they angry at each other, or they just didn't talk to each other? Like,
well, that's what I had to try to kind of figure out. There, in some cases, there were some like past beef, like anger. Yeah. In many cases, it was story. Okay, so this is basically what I started realizing is like, as I listened to them talk, because I had to get them talking about things like, tell me about your work, tell me about this, but it wasn't formal interviews. It was like these little learning spaces, right? And so I could talk about anything and I could ask them about anything and I had to get them to talk. And so of course I was going to use that as a way to try to understand what the heck was going on in this culture. And so I started picking up on kind of these cues or patterns of, oh, all the people in finance tend to talk, like their tone of voice shifts when they talk about marketing or when they talk about this business line or that business line. There was also a laboratory because it was it has not pharmaceuticals, but it has a chemical processes, right? And so, and then I could really see like each of these is an island, and then all these people in these different areas, because I was constantly in contact with like 50 to 60 people, and there were only like 70, 75, right? Within this particular unit that were not in the factory. And so this is the admin side. And so I started realizing like, oh, the finance area is completely convinced that marketing are A, B, and C, right? And marketing thinks that procurement are some idiots and some this and some that. And I started realizing that they really did have narratives. Like they had these stories about why they didn't really socialize, or why this other area, unfortunately, was incompetent or like not good at what they were doing, or like everything would just be better if logistics would get their blah 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 together, and da 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 da. And so I just, since I was this kind of fly on the wall, like I'm neutral. They didn't know I had that challenge. Oh, I should mention that this was between me, HR, and the president.
Got
They
it.
saw me as like learning and English learning, basically, like almost
Got
like a teach, like a glorified teacher,
Right.
right? But I
Right.
had the double charge. So I was able to like get all this information and realize like, oh, this goes way back. And I
Okay.
realized, and there was beef between like the leaders of each of those units. And so it was like each area had their own story about who they were in the organization. And since this was an unhealthy workplace, right, where there wasn't much collaboration between units, um, their leaders didn't get along very well. And so therefore they kind of, transmitted the same story to their team members. And so it was
Yeah.
like, I could just like see this story world going on where like, oh, everyone's in their head and convinced about how they see reality. And they're convinced that the other is like this or like that. And that's
Well,
why.
yeah. So are you thinking to yourself at that point, once you kind of discover this? I imagine it took a little bit of time till you
Yeah.
got to talk to people. But so once you kind of make this discovery and realize this, are you thinking to yourself, well, if I can just change their narratives, I can change this organization?
Right. Yeah. Basically something like, especially like, 28-year-old me is very idealistic in that sense. So yeah, it's just like, okay, so there's a bunch of stories going on and they have some symbols and they have like from anthropology, like, oh, there's areas where like they gossip together. And I found it, those are called in anthropology, those are called like the watering holes, right? So like where the
chisme spots.
chisme spots, chisme being gossip. Yeah. So I started like, oh, this is like where all the storytelling goes on,
Yeah.
but it just happens to be pretty destructive storytelling.
By the way, I have to imagine that nowadays a lot of that happens on like a Slack channel,
oh gosh,
in a Zoom chat or whatever, email,
yes.
all these things.
Oh, do I have stories, especially Slack and Teams, separate channels?
Right.
Oh yeah. And I think it's even more insidious if it's an unhealthy workplace, because
absolutely. I mean, well that's why
get up and walk somewhere, right?
Exactly. And there's no, like, the risk is lower of, or at least perceived, like that someone else is going to hear you. You could, yeah, there are lots of things. I mean, look at the way people, like, I mean, this is an extreme example, but like YouTube comments or something like that. Like it's like the more anonymous you are, and the more,
right. And there's research about that, right? Yeah,
sure.
like that's a real thing. That's a real thing. So, well, at this point, of course, this is however many years ago, and 9 years ago, I guess. And so I kind of have these light bulb moments where I'm like, everything that is affecting this culture is rooted in the invisible stories that they have in their heads, and that they keep feeding, like they feed their story as small teams, right? Yeah. And so I could really like, I could hear procurement people complaining about finance and and they were very fixed and repetitive kinds of narratives. And so I said, okay, what can I do? And anyways, I ended up, the solutions are less important in this case,
Exactly.
but basically I started looking, I spent 2 years there and read a ton, because I had.
So that's what I was going to ask you about, because then I know that you spent, more time than that as a consultant, and then
yes,
and I'm sure that in different projects, this story thing came up in different ways.
That
right?
was, yes, that's the origin.
Yeah. And so, but I'm also curious. So like, what kind of stuff were you reading when you started then kind of doing some research? Like what did you find a little bit in the literature about stories and people in the workplace?
Okay. So then I'm like, all right, so how do you help people get out of their fixed stories, right? That aren't necessarily true. and let's see, I started reading, oh my gosh, everything from like organizational kind of social psychology, and found
Sure.
like psychological safety. So Amy
Yeah.
Edmondson's work.
Yeah.
And I found Brene Brown's work, and Dr. Brene Brown, and her work on, oh, what it means to be wholehearted and vulnerability. And like, okay, there's story elements there. Like how willing are you to put yourself out there so you can really connect? And so like, what is disconnection, and etc.
By the way,
Like,
does she talk explicitly about stories? Or
no,
but it's kind of implicit in a lot
it's
of
there. Yeah. In
yeah,
her books, a little bit more, but
yeah,
like her general work, no, it's more implicit.
yeah.
And I found the work of Annette Simmons, who had done a lot of research on story in the workplace, and story on teams and etc. Started reading her stuff and just really gobbled it up, because she had stuff on like the stories that become so fixed that they turn into kind of like these territorial games, and she gave names to those games that are played, because then power is a really big issue, right? Like I haven't mentioned it, but power dynamics in an organization, especially in, I'm talking like corporate world, for
Totally.
example,
Yeah.
those power dynamics will really affect what's going on, that invisible, intangible part of culture, which is the stories that are being told about.
Yeah, and aren't
and everything.
yeah, aren't power dynamics so often just the stories that we tell ourselves?
They can be, but there's also, well, yes.
I mean,
but
sometimes there's
also
formal.
system.
Yeah,
there's
sometimes there's like
power
formal.
and
Yeah,
systems.
sometimes there's formal. But I think so often power dynamics are also that. It's also the story without. I mean, because even with formal stuff, I mean, one example that comes to mind, right? I could get to a new organization and because of whatever stories I tell myself and maybe my past experiences, I can be very, very hesitant to go into one of the higher ups' office and ask them a question or something like that.
Right.
Because I have a whole narrative around what it means to be at that level, et cetera. And maybe there's even a norm here, but all those are stories that we
yeah.
Right?
And then whatever organization you come into, because an organization is just a collection of people that are supposedly working for the same purpose, right? Supposedly.
Yeah.
But just like right, just like any collective, which would be like the kind of the academic term for it, any group of people that is assembled for a purpose,
Totally.
and consistently together, spending time together, there will be stories. They will have an origin story. So every organization has an origin story, and there's a lot of meaning that is made from that story. Like the founder, like startups, it's very clear to see in startups.
Yeah. I mean,
our founder.
Totally. Yeah. Look, my head goes straight to religion. There's no religion without stories. Period.
Right. Exactly. So that's the thing, is like, I also studied a little bit of philosophy and philosophy of religion. And so one of the things that I see is that, like, oh my gosh, story is really everywhere. And we can't I find this book called The Storytelling Animal, which is about us humans, that we can't not tell ourselves stories, right? So then on the psychology side, so the individual use, I started coming across, right, how from neuroscience and from personality psychology, so narrative identity, narrative psychotherapy, narrative coaching, like, to transform yourself, part of it is like retelling the stories you've told yourself, retelling your trauma stories, seeing it from other angles. In creative writing, we would do, you've probably heard of these exercises where you take like a fairy tale or like a common story, right? Like a Cinderella, and you tell it from the perspective of someone else, and how that like just really changes, even though you're doing it as a playful thing, you tell it from like one of the stepsisters point of view, right? And there's a lot of that out there, but shifting, and how that can completely change our view of reality. And were you going to say something? Sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, you remind me, I had this experience the other day where, my son, Adir, who's 3, and he goes to daycare or like a little play group kind of thing. And sometimes we get pictures or videos. And I noticed that every time I look, it's on like a WhatsApp group. And I noticed that obviously every time I look through the pictures, I mean, you know, the other kids are plenty cute, but I'm really only looking for my own child. And then it dawned on me, well, actually, that's what all the parents are doing, right?
Sure.
Like, and then it dawned on me, well, actually, that's what we're all doing in life, right? We all have that one thing that in every situation that we're looking at, but everyone has their own story and their own frame of mind that they're looking at. And then, of course, like you mentioned before, then sometimes you're in a space where collectively we have the thing that we're looking at. And, you know, if I'm working at Apple, I'm looking at one thing, and then the Microsoft people might be looking at another thing, right?
Yeah.
In similar worlds, but you know, and I just thought that was so fascinating, right? Like I had this moment, I'm picturing all the other parents doing the same thing that I'm doing, but we're each looking for something else completely, right? Our story, so to speak, is totally different.
And the angle. Yeah. And that affects our attitudes and our behavior. So like it actually, when you bring this back to the type of work that we do and that maybe some of our listeners do, which is trying to create or improve kind of that work life experience, and how teams work together, that's really, really crucial because it's a thing that you can't see. Now, it can be a little bit tangible through the way people, like certain phrases that people have and whatever, but like the story in your head really does affect your reality. So it's, you know, it is interpretation, it's your perception, it's the lens through which you're seeing things. And so when it comes to, as I continue to work as a consultant, and I was like, I just became more and more convinced that like, oh, I'm not attracted to story just because it's beautiful and powerful and moving, but when I'm talking about fiction and etc. And it can, but I was like, wow, the story is so powerful because it can get you out of your own story. Like hearing someone else's story, why is that so powerful when it's a, you know, when it's a real story? Well, because you can identify, because it brings, you know, it makes a connection between, it brings connections between like a common humanity. So I can hear the story. I just recently watched that. I don't know if you've seen it, the movie called The Swimmers. And it's based on the true story of these two Syrian sisters who are.
Oh, I started that. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, it's really good. So I'll try not to ruin it completely for you. But I mean, we know the ending. We know that they do go to the Olympics, right?
That's right, yeah.
So the spoiler is already, you can Google that. But anyways, so they're in Syria, and I'm thinking this is like 2014, 15, right? And they're getting ready for Olympics, and then really war really gets terrible in Syria, and they end up deciding that they're going to go to Germany. And so the story, the film is really about their journey and how it transforms them and everything. And I completely lost my thought.
No, well,
wait, no, I was saying something
because you were saying I'll help you. No, you were saying that you've realized that stories are not just about, you know, a beautiful and powerful kind of message or experience, but that you can also use them for very practical ways in, you know, in let's say work and something like that. And I believe that you were starting to talk about The Swimmers as an example of like a very moving and tangible story.
Yeah, well,
line, right.
Remember, yes. So remember the first consulting job that I had that we were just talking about, where my origin of like how I start seeing like, oh, story's really important in the workplace.
That's right.
Oh, story's really, really important in how people behave on their team and with other teams in an organization. And like, if there isn't an intervention on people's stories, if they don't at least question them, it can be really detrimental to the business goals, outcomes, output, etc., because they really just won't work together, like in the worst of cases, right? And so what can get you out of a story? That was one of the things I was trying to, what can get you out of a fixed story of that you have in your head about something, is really being able to engage and hear from someone else's story, because story is also one of the best ways that human beings learn. So if we make sense of life through story naturally without trying to, because it's not like some people do it and some people don't. What we all do, it might look different, but we all do. That's a known fact, that's part of how we're wired. But if it's how we make sense of things, it's how we make meaning, then it also stands to reason that it's how we learn, and we can learn through other people's stories. right? So which is why those of us who are really into fiction, and I don't know if you've read these articles about like people who read fiction are better lovers or better humans because they
Well,
can
I know that there's,
have you heard
yeah,
of
I don't know
this?
about the lovers thing, but I know that there's research, like real research about
Okay, real research. Let's talk about that.
empathy. No, about empathy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So jokes aside, yes. What happens when you are exposed to and you listen or read or engage with a lot of stories from people who have had completely different experiences? So for example, I watched The Swimmers, right? And the story is very engaging. And I have never gone through anything as difficult as what they had to face, the many layers of what they had to face of leaving Syria and still going after their dream to be Olympic swimmers and also make it and also go across in those terrible boats and etc. Everything that implies. And it got me out of my story. Like, for example, in that moment of my life, stories can put things in perspective. Absolutely. Stories can help you have compassion and empathy, right? So outside of the work life, they're very, very powerful and useful. And that's why there's a whole practice of narrative coaching and narrative therapy that is really important to help people see things differently so that their behavior and their attitudes can change in a way that is empowering for them, right? So I start to discover like all of, and of course, then there is the basic, most people, when they think of storytelling, like in the business context, and in fact, like this happens to me all the time since I have storytelling on some of like my LinkedIn and my website and whatever, as much as I try to be very clear that I approach narrative as a tool, a method, a resource for change, for organizational change, people still hear storytelling and they think of like, oh, can marketing. You teach me how to tell really exactly marketing, advertising, or like presentations. So yes, that is another way. Where communication, storytelling and communication is also important. But to be clear, that's not really the focus I'm giving it right now. I was really thinking that's like the visible storytelling, right? I started seeing in my work, and that one consulting project led to another, and I just became more and more fascinated with like, these stories are like really, really important. And since they're not visible, it's like the invisible forces that are shaping culture and shaping human behavior. Like, what can we do about it? Because I would see as I started working with other consultants and reading up about like change management, I remember reading like traditional change management stuff that you can like Google. So if like you Google right now, how to do a change management project in your organization, whatever, you'll find like some models and they have some acronyms and it's like PR, whatever. And so use give me a P, give me whatever. They're very similar. And I'm not discrediting change management because I am a change management professional. But apart from the models, one of the things that really, as I was in these organizations and trying to bring about change, I just found them so, I guess they weren't going deep enough. I didn't think that change would be sustained because it's like, you're ignoring the way that human beings make sense of their experience within an organization. And if that doesn't change, they will not really change their behavior. We'll all change our behavior it's like the guy who gets a girlfriend, right? And she's like, smoking is terrible. I don't want you to smoke. If you want to be with me, you better stop smoking. And he's like, yeah, of course, lover. I am going to stop smoking. And he stopped smoking for like 6 months or 8 months or whatever it is. And then of course, inevitably, he has not changed his story about smoking. I'm just giving a dumb example, right?
Like, so let me make sure.
It goes back to it.
Let me make sure I understand you correctly. So what I'm thinking about, like, in the workplace, right? Going back to your initial example, let's say we really need accounting to talk to marketing, because if they don't talk to each other, they're going to overspend or etc. Whatever, whatever it might be. But they're not talking to each other because they've had a falling out, or they, I don't know, marketing thinks that accounting thinks that they think that they're dumb or whatever, right? I mean, that's kind of the way
he said, she said, yes.
And so let's say, I hire some consultant, and they, maybe they work for a software company too, and they're like, ooh, I'm going to implement this really great software for you. And that's going to make it really, it's going to make it really easy for them to communicate with each other, and they're going to be able to, it's going to be, their work is going to be visible to each other, and this is going to be great. So, but what you're saying is like, okay, that might be nice. And if the problem really was like they were just too far from each other or couldn't reach each other, then like, hey, that could be nice. But actually, you didn't change anything about the story that they have about each other, and so you didn't do anything. And so what I hear you saying is that what you came to understand pretty quickly is that in organizations and in any kind of change and any project, anything that you're trying to anytime that you're trying to like move the workplace forward in some way, right? You want them to evolve in some way.
Yeah.
It's really right. That's right. It's really important to be aware of what are the stories. Right? Yeah. What are the stories people are telling each other? Sometimes the stories are, hopefully most often, they're great. And, and there's no problem. There's no issue. It's wonderful. The story is that we have we have the best, I don't know, we have a great manager, or we don't. Yeah. We have freedom here. We have, everyone is healthy, and etc. But sometimes it's not, and it's really, really important to be aware of some of this stuff. So let's fast forward a little bit.
Yeah.
Is that, and am I kind of understanding that correctly?
Yes. It's just that, like, if you want the people at your organization to like adopt a new process or change a process. Yeah. You can use incentives and you can use punishments to get their behavior to change pretty quickly. Yeah. But they'll definitely have a story about it and probably some resistance. And in the end, after a few months, they'll probably go back to what they were already doing, or they'll leave, or they'll be angry because you never dealt with the story that they had about the way that they were doing things, and they were probably pretty satisfied with the way they were doing things. Yeah. And so so it's like, if you want this, if it's easy to make people change their behavior for a little bit of time, but if you want engagement and real culture change, then you have to deal with that, with the invisible part, with the intangible part of human behavior and human sense making.
Amazing. Yeah. Okay, so this is all really helpful, and as far as I'm concerned, we could end the podcast here, and I think that's already it's already great. I think we already have a lot of it. But you just did this awesome project. You did a thesis. Thank you. And I think it would be interesting to even just to spend a few minutes talking about that. And maybe we could start. Maybe you could tell me and tell our audience. So as you start to do this research for your thesis, what was kind of the problem? That you've come to learn about an aspect in the workplace related to stories, related to narrative, that you were maybe trying to solve through your research?
Yeah, in the most basic of terms, I landed on I landed on teams within an organization instead of like the whole organization. Yeah. Because they're kind of like the cells, like the building blocks of org culture. I still love organizational culture as a concept and everything. But I focused on teams, and the problem. By the
way, is one of the reasons you focused on teams was just because that's a little bit easier to measure than measuring, because you're not just because of the structure of the kinds of. Yes,
right? And yes, and I also, because in the first step of first step of research, you kind of go into the academic world and you're like, okay, but what are they already saying about these topics, right? And I think one of our professors really helped me kind of frame what is research. And the way that he said is like, academic research is really just contributing to a conversation that is already ongoing, like around whatever topic, right? And so when you think of it that way, of course, the first thing I did was like, okay, so what are they saying? What's out there when it comes to narrative and organizations? And I found a lot on the individual side, and so psychology, and a lot on organization. And like, there's pretty good researchers out there, like talking about organizational storytelling, right? and I found hardly anything, like literally one that had to do with teams
Right.
and narrative. And so I was like, this is interesting, and it's probably going to be a little bit easier to study given I'm just one person, you know. To study a whole organization, you know, a little more time. Like it's a bigger
absolutely scope. It's a bigger project. Yeah. Yeah.
So with that in mind, then I was like, okay, so teams. What do teams, there was like a one basic one, like does kind of like what role does narrative in this as in terms of sense making, right? Internal narratives, what role do internal narratives play in this issue of building a good team, to put it in very simple terms? So like I was like, okay, most people want good teams. Sure. Good defined in a really broad way, like very effective, sure, that they get along together, that they work well together, you know, they play well together, right. That they can meet their objectives or their goals or whatever this has. So like good teams is an important part of organizations, whether for profit or not, meeting or reaching their goals.
And you're saying good teams, not only in terms of do they produce good work, but also
how they get along.
Are they okay while they're doing it?
Yeah. The human side of it as well, not just like, do these machines produce what we need to, to produce?
Exactly. Right. That's right.
So I looked for like a term, like in the academic literature, like what would that be called? Because effectiveness, a team being effective, they could be toxic AF, right? Sure. But very effective. Right.
So
that's not interesting to me. That would not.
What was the term?
The term is collective efficacy. So so it comes from sociology. It's used more in sociology, and it's basically just this idea that a collective, a group of individuals that are united for some type of purpose, right? That the collective has shared beliefs that we can do things together. We have kind of like common purpose, common identity when we're together. And we can face difficult challenges together. So like grow, like we evolve, we can do things.
Yeah.
Well,
is this similar to Albert Bandura's self-efficacy?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we were going to go too deep into the academic part, but yeah, it's actually the same.
I just wanted to show off that I also know, and I can even know, and I'm so smart that I can quote the guy's name.
That's good. Okay.
That's just what I'm trying to show. That's what I'm trying to show the audience is all. Our audience of 3, you know, how brilliant I am that I can quote the researcher's name. I mean,
300. All 300 are very, No, I was trying not to take up too much time, but yes, you're absolutely right. So Albert Bandura, the psychologist who kind of coined this term self-efficacy, right?
Which is really like the belief, like I can do
things. I have some agency and say in what happens in my life. So therefore, like I am not a victim of circumstances. I can do things.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, you were really curious about, okay, on a team, what kind of narratives lead to collective efficacy on a team?
Or like, is there a relationship between the two? Like, it's more that. It's more because like I said, I did come in with like the baseline assumption, right? That people are telling stories about their team.
Right.
How it shows up, I could be surprised in many ways. Or like, what are the vehicles through which people kind of on a team tell their stories?
And Alma, and why is that an important thing to know?
Because we want good teams. We want good teams, but good teams, like many teams research has shown, is a combination not of just like the right conditions being like good processes and roles and responsibilities and maybe, like good pay, those kind of like external visible things. That's like the conditions, some of the conditions for a good team, but that there's also this other part that has to do with attitudes and beliefs and behavioral norms. So like expectations about like, how do I behave and treat others within this team? So one of the more famous ones being like psychological safety, that has been highly researched, right? And empathy and emotional intelligence. Like these are those invisible or so-called soft skills that are a really important component of a good team,
Yeah.
right? Of what, like how you can actually really build and sustain a good team. So
Yeah.
the problem is like when it comes to that stuff, the psychological safety, the emotional intelligence, the attitudes that people bring to their team, the way that they show up on their team, very little has been done around story. Yet we just established for whatever 40 minutes that story is the main way that human beings make sense of their experience, and story therefore guides, right? Like our behavior and our attitudes come from the stories that we have in our head. So it was like, well, this has to be important. It just hasn't necessarily been studied much on teams because, right, they focused maybe on other areas. So the problem is like, if I want to have good teams, it's not just the conditions, but like, how do I really influence human behavior and create sustained change? That's, yeah. It's about good teams in the more broad sense of like also a good environment, also like a healthy way of relating to each other on top of good outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Top of good outcomes. So that was it. Cause I was like, but there's this part of the equation that I can see very clearly is story, like narrative sense making. And why isn't it being studied? And yeah, so I decided to take a stab at it.
Amazing. So Alma, so you did a qualitative study, meaning you actually went and talked to people. You did conducted interviews, and I know that you learned a lot, and I think that if people are interested, I highly encourage them to read your executive summary, and we could link to that perhaps, or
I'll be doing some stuff on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, right. Okay,
yeah. Get it out. I want to get conversation going. I think that's important.
Yeah, that's a great idea. But maybe just share, if you could share with us, maybe just a few things that you learned conducting this research about.
Oh goodness.
About the role that story plays in how people make sense of their team experience.
Yeah, so I talked to people in I think 8 different industries, so sectors, right? So for profit and a few in not for profit.
Any difference that you can tell?
No, with that sample set, the size was just no.
Yeah.
I talked to some people on global teams, a lot on US based teams.
Any difference there?
To people in their 20s, 30s. I would say there's heightened, at least in the people that I talked to, there was more sensitivity to creating good emotional conditions and attitudinal conditions within a team on the global teams, like more sensitivity to like everyone's coming from a different perspective, like not assuming that we have the same exact values or preferences.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. Which I think should happen even on a nationally based team or whatever.
100%.
Right.
But it makes sense, right? It makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Already aware we speak with different accents or whatever it is, right?
Yeah. So we have different assumptions about like what is good communication, what is good behavior on a team, etc.
Yeah.
So, but I mentioned kind of the sample size because it was like, it wasn't like I just talked to people in tech or just talked to people in finance or whatever. I really tried to get a wider sample. And so I asked those people that I got to sit down with for an hour to tell me about 5 to 6 stories, each of them, of like experiences that they've had with their team. And by listening to those stories, one of the biggest findings, which was really, really cool, was to see that another thing, these people had all been with their team for at least a year.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And these are the majority of like 5 to 8 people on their team. And these are interdependent teams. So like they really do have to work together. A lot in order to reach their goals. So that's the type of teams I was looking for. And so once I hear all their stories and I look through them and etc., I start picking up on these patterns, and I see how from the beginning, because some of them tell me stories about like when they first started, and then like there was a moment when they felt really connected and a moment when they felt really disconnected, and like within all these different scenarios that I asked them to tell me about, I could see a through line, like a thread, right? Like a through, which in other words is like a macro narrative, a bigger story that they were already convinced of about their team's identity.
Mhm.
So,
So can you
you
give us
might
an
not,
example?
yeah. So, like you might not be able to pick up on it in just one story, but basically when you,
Maybe like what I'm curious about, like,
yeah,
so is if you have an example maybe of like one of the interviews you did, and if you could maybe
yeah,
mention just briefly a number of different points or
yeah,
different stories that they told you, and then what kind of through line you're able to
yeah.
see.
So one of my favorite, because it was a very interesting through line, is a guy who had started on kind of a tech finance team, completely remote, and he was in a different part of the States, and a lot of them happened to be um, in one city, right? So,
Mhm.
and they had been there together, and he's new. And at one point in the interview, he tells me a story about how he had felt pretty disconnected from them, like didn't know what his role was.
Yeah.
People couldn't really help him, was just kind of like floundering, like, what do I actually do, etc. Who do I help? And they're kind of like, well, you kind of just got to figure it out. We deal with a lot of ambiguous things, kind of depends on what the client needs, kind of. And he actually said, he was like, it was actually like 3 months like that. And
Mm.
then he has this turning point. Now, he doesn't tell me this is my turning point, but a turning point because if when you know story structure, you're like, oh, this is where he really had, there was like a 180 in how he was making sense of his team.
Mm.
So he went from like this team that was kind of like distant,
Distant. Yeah.
have much connection, like they might not be bad people there, but I'm really not part of them. I don't belong. They do hang out. I'm just kind of out here by myself on this, remote team, whatever. And he tells me a story, and it happens to his first big turning point is these happy hours, virtual happy hours that they do, where each week the company pays for the lunch. So, they order DoorDash. Each person is at their house, right? They eat lunch on camera together while one of them is presenting something that doesn't have to do with work, like a
That's fine.
hobby or a passion. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in this case, he finally gets, like, he's coming up on the 3 months, and he gets invited to present any hobby that you want, and just kind of like to teach the rest of the team.
Yeah.
So this was a little bit bigger team. There were like 12 of them or something.
Okay.
And so he teaches them some really cool card game from the area that he's from. And these people love it. And then they reach out to him, and they're like, on Teams, they're just like, can you teach us more? But what about this? But what about that? But da 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 da. And it's just so much that they want to talk to him about this card game that he ends up putting on like an extracurricular, let's say, like an extra happy hour.
Amazing.
And just like, hey, I'm going to do another one so we can kind of play it together because it's going to be easier for you to understand. So they end up getting on, and it ends up being like 2 hours long, and they're laughing and whatever. And he actually says to me, he doesn't know what my research question is, right? Like he doesn't know that I'm actually studying his stories.
Sure.
So that's important to know. He actually says to me, this is almost verbatim. I'm not looking at it, but it's almost verbatim. He's like, yeah. And that was kind of the moment, like after that happy hour, it was like, oh, I'm finally in. I'm finally a part of this team. So that was see how that phrase alone tells you he made sense of his experience through that turning point of connecting with them through the hobby, right? The hobby presentation.
Amazing.
And so that's one way. And then the other stories that he told me, there's like 6 other moments, experiences that he's had with his team. That phrase is kind of repeated. Like he ends up saying, he keeps talking about this team that like, we're really like this. Also, he's speaking a lot in the first person plural. So we are this, we are like that. Oh, we're really good at doing this. And like, yeah. And so we'll talk about this and we'll talk about that. Like that is also an indication of like, he's feeling part of. And so going back to the macro narrative idea, and there's more details, but to not get into the details, basically, I'm able to see how these stories kind of map out chronologically, and I can see the shift. I actually did a visual for it, and I can see the shift and like how his story about his team and how great they are with every experience, he just becomes more convinced of it. And clearly he is having what he considers are good experiences with this team.
Totally.
He feels connected, and they do go through some difficult things. And he tells a story of like when they completely drop the ball with a client and it's like a huge mess. But by this point, he's like 8 months in and he's already convinced that this is a great team and they've got my back, right? Like that's the way that he is seeing the team. And so that story just becomes more and more, it becomes more and more like solidified in his mind. Like, no, we're and he consequently had ranked his team as like 10s on like how well they work together, you know, how much they overcome challenges, the little like survey that I did at the beginning. And along with that was this another surprising finding for me. I had one question there about like, does your team have any rituals or routines? Could you tell me about this ritual routine and like the last time that you felt really connected through that ritual or routine? And every team was different. But the teams that considered that they had this good collective efficacy, those teams all had routines, connection routines.
Okay,
and
so once again, so that actually, that's great, because that's actually a very practical takeaway, right?
Yes, it is.
Right, like you know, especially, I mean, you could say this with all teams, but especially teams if you're remote and et cetera. I mean, it seems like it would be so important to have rituals like that. But I just want to make sure, like, based on that example, and also based on what I think I know about your research, it sounds like it seems to me like you found, or at least have a very strong suspicion, that narrative does play a very strong role in whether or not there's collective efficacy on teams.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And I would say that it's like, because as we said before, I think something very practical here is like, the humans on your team are making sense of their experiences and they have a story in their head about the team, right? It's not like, is this happening on my team? No. It definitely is.
Right. So
that's not the question. So then what does that, if that's happening, does that like impacting at all your ability to have a team that does work well together, that has collective efficacy? And yes, at least from my, right, we've got to acknowledge.
Sure, of course, there are limitations, etc. But your current understanding of the issue.
Not only do people begin to have like they become more convinced of what their team is like as time goes on, for better or for worse, because I talk to people on both ends of the spectrum, as in, oh, my team's like 10, 10, 10, great. And like, oh gosh, 4 or 5,
some wonderful teams, weaker teams that need help.
The working teams. Yes.
So one very practical takeaway that you already gave us was routines. Routines seem to be really, really important.
Well, but let me say a little bit more about that. So what was really interesting is like, it can't just be any type of routine, because I talked to a few, so those who are on teams that didn't have any collective efficacy, right? A few of them actually like lamented and reflected on the fact that, oh, we used to have like these connection rituals. We used to do things that were a little bit more personal, just as human beings, right? And now we do very transactional or mechanical things, as in all of the teams have meetings. That's pretty standard. Teams have meetings. The meeting in and of itself is not a connection routine. I think we know this, right? Not all meetings create connection. No. Let us not think that. So just because you meet regularly does not mean that that is a connection routine. Now, what that connection routine may look like can differ from industry and like age group and so many things, right? So some of these teams, I'll give you a few examples. Some of them had like the happy hour things, right? Really chill, really laid back. Others do like Friday afternoons. They play games online. I personally wouldn't want to do that, but there are teams who want to do that. Others just have like little gratitude shout out types of routines built into their meeting times. Others had pranks that they would play like as initiation when there was a new person on the team, etc. So the way it looks could vary, but it does have to be about connection, because basically what I found out is that like, oh, these moments of the routines, whether they're 10 minutes or an hour, right? They're consistent weekly or biweekly. And they also tend to be a place where people collectively are telling stories about the team.
Yeah.
Right. It's like the place where it's kind of like, it's like a more controlled watering hole. So it's like, instead of people going off and gossiping on a Slack channel, this is a place where they're getting to know each other. And so going back, really, this is the relevance here, is like going back to my first consulting gig. The question I had was like, how do I intervene? Like, how do I help people get out of their stories about other teams? And one of the main ways to do it was to facilitate spaces where they would have to interact with people and have experiences that directly contradicted the story that they had in their head. Example, the people on procurement team in these events that I would do would have to have normal conversations and do fun activities with people in finances. And through that, they'd be like, oh, she's not such a blah, blah, blah. Oh, maybe they actually like have to listen to each other. And that starts breaking down the walls. That's kind of what routines seem to do in teams.
Totally.
It don't allow people to get all in their heads.
Yeah. Well, another way I think to put it, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that it's really important if we human beings are on a team with other human beings, that we do something to acknowledge that common humanity. Yeah. And that is, and that is more than just like, of course, we meet with each other so that we can achieve our work goals. No. We have to make sure, we have to acknowledge that we are humans. And this is important because look, there's a constant conversation that is happening in the world of work, which is like, oh, how much of myself do I bring? Should I be? And we've talked about this on other episodes, right? Bringing your authentic self to work, et cetera, and like all important questions, right? And answer those as you are. But it seems to me, from what I'm hearing, that at least to some degree, it's really important in order to achieve. In order to have a team that has high levels of collective efficacy, it's important to have some sort of routine that acknowledges our common humanity.
Because that's a way that they can storytell together that is positive, right? That acknowledges common humanity. That's a very, very good way. Instead of them going off into little groups and little sects and like gossiping about each other.
Exactly, because that's the thing. If we don't do that, then
they'll do it anyways.
Exactly. Then we just automatically do it. And then it just depends, right? Like if I happen to have, I could go back on it's based on my psychology, my history, whatever, my culture, all that, right?
Yeah. So it's like, we've got to be, I think the second takeaway is like, the stories that people have about their team and team identity. So like team identity through narrative is really important part of collective efficacy. Right. Yeah. So you've got to have spaces so that people can kind of build that identity together. So it can be like socially constructed, co-created, co-constructed. And that happens in connection routines and in other moments. Right. So if you are a leader of the team and if you have any say in how that team does things together, not only the connection routines, but like paying attention to the cues, like understanding story. Not as a literature buff, not as like, you don't have to go that deep, but like understanding that people in their minds have kind of like a narrative arc about what is going on. And that is affecting the way that they show up in a team. So give them plenty of space to be able to sense make aloud. I think what's dangerous is.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by
aloud?
What is sense make aloud?
So to make sense of their experiences out loud, not just in their heads.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah,
I understand that's what it means. But like, okay, but how do we do that?
Okay, so yeah, exactly. Going to a specific example, like there's many ways that might look, and I think that really depends on the culture, the industry, the generation, etc. But basically, you want spaces where people can reflect on their experiences. So sometimes in a company, they'll do things like teams that work on projects do like postmortems, right? So they talk, once the project has died, what did we learn? What went well? What didn't go well? What would we change? That can be a really great narrative sense-making forum, right? To say it. So, but of course, there's got to be some trust, and there's got to be, that's a very formal one. There's informal space.
Well, another thing that came to me is that I know that there's research about teams that have higher levels of what's called reflexivity. So, which means to not only think about your outcomes and your work outcomes, but about how you actually do your work. And I can guess that that a certain kind of exercise that would allow people to express out loud.
That's what I mean. Is like
how they're doing their work. Yeah,
to get it out of their heads, because they are already telling themselves a story, but to feel safe enough, right?
Exactly.
And to feel like they're in the place where they could, like, gosh, when we had that meeting, like, it was really, just to give an example, like, it was really tense, and I did not like your attitude, or I did not like this tone, or I don't think we made a good decision. I didn't feel heard, blah, blah, blah. I know a lot of this can sound like conflict.
It is. It's true, but you're right. That's why we need to be intentional about building these kinds of, actually, the way you said it before about making it a routine, or making it a practice, because that actually takes away a lot of those challenges that you're mentioning.
Yeah, because it's like, if you get stuck in, all of us know that when you get stuck in your head about something, right, and you're only seeing your story, you're only seeing your perspective, that doesn't lead to pro-social behavior usually. and in the end,
pro-social meaning helpful, right? Meaning being positive,
helpful for the social.
That's right.
The not just the individual, but for the whole
for the
group, right? It does not lead to pro group. It does not lead to pro team behavior, because you might be stuck in your head about something, and it could be about something positive. You could also be really convinced that it was your confidence in your skill that led the team to really succeed, right? Like, that's still not really leading to pro group behavior.
Exactly.
So it's not just like the negative things. It's also like, people need to make sense of things and tell their stories about how they went through whatever experience it was, aloud, together, that it's facilitated. I think that is part of at least my understanding definition of what can make a good leader, is that they create those spaces so that people can tell their stories. And I'm not talking mushy gushy, like, when I was 5. No, I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about their stories of, like, what they've been through on the team, of what they went through with a client, of what they went through with an internal client, etc. Like, just to be able to express that aloud, so that there can be some kind of, since they're working on a team, right? So that other perspectives can be brought into that story, and it can be broadened and worked with, right? So that it doesn't get so fixed in their head. The trend of teams that have low collective efficacy that I saw is that, as they had negative turning points, so like the opposite of the example that I shared, they felt moments where they felt disconnected, then they didn't have any opportunity to kind of reflect aloud,
right,
in a way that was safe. What did they do? They withdraw more and more into their story of the team. Well, this really isn't a team for me. Well, this blah, blah, blah. And they become more convinced. And actually, of the people that I interviewed, that was back right in December, January, 3 out of 4 have left the teams that they were with.
Wow. So it really, that's an illustration of how crucial it is to be aware of these things. I mean, there's this really good book that I'm in the middle of reading right now. It's called The Art of Possibility, and it's by a guy named Benjamin Zander. Do you know it, Ben Zander?
Oh, I'm obsessed with him.
Yeah.
I'm obsessed with everything he does. He's
right. He's incredible.
Yeah, I love
incredible.
it.
So then I don't need to tell you, but he tells this great story where they're rehearsing, and he can tell that just one of the violinists is like, she's upset about something, but he doesn't know. And he goes over to her afterwards, like, hey, what's up? Everything okay? And first of all, she's taken aback, because I guess apparently conductors often don't ask.
They're not known for that.
Not known for that, right? But then she's like, look, I don't know, maybe they were practicing like Mahler's Ninth or something, and she's like passionate about Mahler's work, and she's like, I think we're going like a little too fast or whatever. And he's like, oh my goodness, I didn't, and basically he ends up slowing it down for her, and she, becomes the most like passionate person and really, really into it and whatever. And, but like the point is that like he gave her an opportunity, and this is a little bit different because there's a leader and he actually, solicited feedback, and maybe it's more of a lesson in leadership, but actually like an orchestra is very much a team, and and giving people space. And he's got other great examples of how to do this, but giving people on your orchestra like space to be able to reflect out loud or in writing or whatever about the stories and about their experience and stuff like that is crucial for collective efficacy.
Yes.
This is amazing, Alma. Thank you for sharing all of this. Is there anything that, I'm sure there are many more details, but are there any other takeaways that you want to mention, or anything that you think is important before we close? So we've and we could also do a part 2 and 3 as far as I'm concerned. I think this is fascinating. I really do. And not only fascinating, useful, very, very useful.
Yeah. I think I would go back to, an episode, kind of the, one of the takeaways from the episode with Francis Poe, which I think was like episode 2 or 3 or something, right? And curiosity. I think curiosity and story in building like effective teams or teams with collective efficacy is really, really important. I think if you are a leader, like be curious about story as a story format, what it looks like, structure, like what is in a story, right? Be a little bit curious about that. And then 2, be curious about the people on your teams, the stories that they have. And I think if you lead with that kind of curiosity, instead of like, what's the gossip? What's the gossip now? Who's gossiping about who? Who's da-da-da-da? Because like, gossip is just, unfortunately, storytelling that doesn't have an opportunity to be shared in a constructive way.
Right.
It's just the flip side. It's still human storytelling nature. Right. And I know why is it so destructive? Why are we like, gossip? Well, because it's behind people's back, and it might be with malicious and whatever. Right. But if you can provide spaces for healthy gossip, open, behind closed doors or in closed Slack channels, then leading with curiosity, I think you can really do amazing things. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Alma, for sharing all of this with us. I am with me and with our hundreds of thousands of listeners.
Oh my gosh, we gotta stop doing that. We gotta value ourselves in our podcast.
It's true. I know. I do. It's we could psychoanalyze it a different time. But stories.
Yes. See,
I suspect that narrative and stories is a theme that we're going to revisit hopefully many times in future episodes. So I'm excited to think more about how we use stories and how we can use stories to really to better our lives, to better our work lives, and to better our teams.
Let's see what I'd love to all the listeners, feedback for us. Tell us a story. What did you learn? What questions you have? And we'll see what we can do, from there. So
amazing. And that's right. And we look forward to seeing you back here very soon for another very exciting episode.
Woo! Thank you.
Right. Thank you. So Alma, feel free to give me flowers anytime.
Okay. A little much, but okay.
You know what? That's what we're trying to get. That's what we're trying to normalize.
Okay, normalize. I do love flowers too, and I really support this movement, and I hope you get it going.